Mark Dempster has been a practicing psychotherapist and drug counselor for the past 20 years. He currently runs his practice from Harley Street, where he specializes in addiction issues. Mark is committed to making sure that the option of a complete recovery is open to all addicts who seek help. In addition to his counseling practice, Mark remains a passionate member of Narcotics Anonymous. He's a firm believer in the philosophy that one can only keep what one has by giving it away. His voluntary work includes helping out on a 12-step helpline and facilitating 12-step meetings in a detox unit. He speaks regularly at addiction conferences and contributes to many specialist publications on the subject. In his autobiography, Nothing to Declare, Mark charts his early life and his journey from heroin addiction, dealing, drug smuggling, homelessness, and destitution to turning his life around, becoming clean, and ultimately one of the most respected addiction counselors in the UK. You can learn more about Mark's work by going to www.markdempstercounseling.com. So, Mark, whenever you're ready, feel free to get started. I'm really excited about this, and best of luck. All right.
Okay. Thank you, Niall. Thank you. Okay. Hello, guys. My name's Mark, and it's good to be here today. And I really hope that I can sort of shine a light on the process of Schema Therapy as well to treat addiction, but also just to give you some personal stories along the way too about my own journey with addiction and how I've used Schema Therapy to help myself and to help countless others suffering from addiction. It might be worthwhile adding at the beginning of this talk, really, the sort of characteristics that I notice being somebody that's in recovery from addiction and how this relates to Schema Therapy. They often talk about, and you'll see in my slides later on, they talk about the temperament of the individual and how the temperament of the young person, bearing in mind that the sort of core issues really that come from these schemas is really from the beginning is the vulnerable, at the centre of it is the vulnerable child and also the angry child, but really certainly the vulnerable child. Now, as it relates to me from somebody who grew up in a family of addiction, and I don't want to spend too long talking about this, but because I really want to get on, there's so much to cover here as far as the schema. But I grew up in a family. My father was an alcoholic. My grandfather was an alcoholic. There was gambling in the family as well. My other grandfather was a gambler, so there was a history of addiction, and I grew up from a young age. There's no coincidence that I wound up becoming a therapist, because from a young age I started to caretake and look after my father. Really, I started to see, and I wrote about this in my first book, really about how I started to hide his alcohol and ensure that I locked the door and he had the DTs and he'd be sick. So from a young age, I was very vulnerable, and I looked for attention and validation often. Now, I don't know as far as the temperament, when we talk about the temperament, I know that there was a sensitivity, an oversensitivity that I had as a young child that I seen some of my friends didn't have. They didn't feel criticisms or slights or offences to the same degree, where I felt it as like a core wound to me personally. And it's quite interesting, because you could take two children. Bowlby was very good when he talked about attachment and disorganised and ambivalent attachment, but being at the root of it. But you could take two children. You could have the father saying exactly the same information. He could be telling them both off, and one child will take that information and go over it and over it and over it in his mind and question it and go, what does that mean? And this, he really doesn't like me and he hates me. And the other child would take it like water off a duck's back. We just wouldn't even acknowledge it, really. And I think that lies at the root. And So there's what I recognise in myself personally, but also in the work that I do with thousands of addicts I've seen over the years, is that there's an oversensitivity at the core, and there's often this very overcritical mind, which I'll talk about in some of the coping strategies that are developed as a result of these maladaptive schemas. Now, coupled with my friend, I'm quite friendly with Russell Brand, and he done a talk a few years ago with Professor Nutt and another friend of mine, Chip Summers, and they identified in the brain using fMRI scanning. Professor Nutt used to work for the Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs in Britain, and through this fMRI scanning, they could see that in the brain of people with addictions, they could see the three areas that were compromised were dopamine production, which I'm sure Anna will talk about later on, impulse control and stress management, the three parts of the brain that they could see the difference from people who had addictions to those with non-addictions when they scanned, like they done a survey on this. So at the root, and dopamine as a neurotransmitter, not just gives you that meaning, that sense of well-being and that uplift to your state of mind, but also provides that meaning and purpose in life. Now we know that if we take it back as hunter-gatherers, if we had a depletion of dopamine, that would have been a survival risk for us. In packs, and you would have been ostracized from the pack because you would have been less buoyant, you'd have been more depressed, and therefore it would have been a survival threat because you would have been pushed out of the tribe. So there's a school of thought that people that have got addictions, and I really understand this, that as opposed to addiction being looked at as the person's weak-willed, it's the opposite really that I see, that they're very incredibly strongly willed. It's the will that's the problem when it's focused on the addictive behavior, whether it's drugs, alcohol, gambling, sex, it could be anything, internet. But where that will is focused on a productive area, they will do incredibly well in their life. So if you can get somebody clean and sober from whatever the behavior is, then if you channel that same myopic, obsessive drive, they'll do. In fact, my friends I've got friends who are famous guitarists. The reason he's a famous guitarist is because when he plays the guitar, he's obsessive and compulsive around it. So this is why we find that a lot of people who have got, a lot of the people that I see here in Harley Street are really successful business people. They're brokers or whatever they are, they're musicians, incredibly talented people. But when it comes to the addiction to, and of course we've got lots of addictions that are normalized within the society, because if you think of workaholism, it's sort of promoted really to some degree, and celebrated. The chief exec who's making a fortune and is promoted to that position, everybody sort of celebrates the success rather than so if I go to and just to say, I came into recovery from addiction when I was 32 years old. I had been I'd got involved with a lot of crime when I was younger. I'd wound up being an international drug smuggler for years. I wound up in prisons in different countries, and then eventually when I got clean, I had the good fortune to meet Eric Clapton when I was really early in my recovery, and then a few years later, another musician encouraged me to write the first book, and also then I started to train. Before that, I was starting to train as a therapist, well, to become a therapist, and it's been that's nearly 26 years ago. So just to talk about the origins of Schema Therapy, it comes from Jeffrey Young. Really, he worked very closely with Aaron Beck throughout the 60s and 70s. He basically could see, Jeffrey Young could see that, and it was originally used to treat personality disorders as well as complex trauma. And he could see that, CBT went so far, but we needed to look at the roots really of of sort of trauma and the vulnerable child, and to identify really the various sort of traps that people can get stuck in. And he created these. There's two different school. There's some school of thought saying there's 18. They've just split it up into different amounts. There's one book which is Reinventing Your Life by Jeffrey Young, where there's just 11 schemas. I work from the position with my clients here from the 11 schemas, which was the original one, I believe, and I'll talk you through and how this is relevant as regards addiction. And so if I go over, you know, I've talked about when treating addiction, we treat outward symptoms. Why I've said about really the outward addiction, because the drugs and the alcohol or the gambling or the sex or the internet, whatever the addictive process is, that is merely the symptom. That's the outward manifestation of what we would probably call now a disorder. I'm not really big on illness or and certainly not disease, but what they would definitely call a disorder, just like an eating disorder. And so the outward manifestation is the drugs or the alcohol or the gambling. But what are the underlying? So if the addiction is the symptom is like the drugs or alcohol or gambling, it's like that, and the addiction is like this. So what is the addiction? The addiction is, as we talk about, is the life traps. Now, everybody has schemas, you know, like we create schemas from a young age. You know, like as soon as I see a traffic lights, I know that a green means go, a red means stop, you know, means stop. We, from a young age, we create a map of the world, basically, an adaptive, and in order to survive, and in order to create meaning, like to understand your place in the world and how you relate to others. And we create a variety of narratives, many narratives based on, you know, our life growing up. But what happens is where there's been trauma, or where there's been neglect or abandonment, or you know, where there's been a lot of addiction in the family, but it doesn't have to be addiction. This is the other thing is, I've worked with a lot of people who don't have any outward addictions, but certainly have been sent off to, say, a public school, a private school, and they've been sent off, and they've felt really hurt and abandoned, and their temperament is so that they've felt incredibly, they've felt an internal wound about being sent off, and or there's a variety of different ways that people can be wounded. I've done a lot of men's weekends where we really try to get to the core wound, and to try and let the person heal from that by creating sort of psychodrama, or creating some type of process to get them in touch with that child, that vulnerable child that was hurt many moons ago, and who creates adaptive mechanisms to deal with that pain. On this, the diagnosis I'm talking about, addressing the core schemas, can have a beneficial effect that reverberate through many areas of the individual's life. We can often see where somebody's stuck in a particular schema by the narrative they create. I've always had this problem. I'm always going to be rejected. I'm ugly. I'm unattractive. I'm not enough, really. I've said here, schemas being hard to change are supported by cognitive behavioural and elements that determines how we feel, think, act, and relate to others. Life traps are usually developed as children as appropriate adaptations to immediate family environment. These patterns were realistic. So what's really important about this is whatever maladaptive schemas are created from childhood, they're no longer relevant as an older man or even as a teenager, but they act as a coping mechanism to deal with the pain at that time. So the internal critic that's set up, for example, with my father was incredibly critical, and he was an alcoholic. So he was drunk a lot of the time, or he wouldn't be present. So I chased like it was almost like he was on the back of a train, and I was chasing up the tracks and he was just waving at me, no matter what I'd done, the goalposts always moved, and I could never get time with him. So I was always feeling this longing, this deep sense of like longing for his love or his validation. But also what happened within that, I internalized the message that I'm not enough, that he doesn't like me if he really liked me. Because of course we know that up to the age of 9, more or less, all children's world is egocentric. They think that everything revolves around them, really. And so I would internalize there, then there's something about me that why can't he give me this attention? Why can't he give me his wallet? There's something flawed and wrong about me. So therefore, one of the schemas that was set up immediately was, apart from the emotional deprivation and abandonment schema, was also a defectiveness life trap as well, that I'm defective, that I'm flawed. Now, put on top of this, years later, lots of drugs and alcohol, these schemas get magnified out of proportion, because if I've already got the schemas from childhood, and then I start to use some of the avoidance strategies. Now, one of them being we talk about the detached self-soother is one of the avoidance. This is the coping strategies to deal with the internal critic. If I start soothing on alcohol and drugs, these schemas get magnified even more. So by the time I get into recovery, when I first done this questionnaire, it was like I was like answering very high for the top mark is 60. I was like 55 for each of the schemas. Well, apart from 2 of them, but it was just because I'd already developed these schemas, which went on sort of recognized for lots of years. I never knew that, because that was my life, and I thought, oh, that's normal to think and behave in this particular manner. So I'll go through that, because I think it'll be really useful, and I'll come back to these. I just want to go to the actual schemas themselves, right? So, and how it's relevant to addiction, right? Now, the first schema here, we've got abandonment, and basically that's created. Now, everybody has schemas. Everybody has, a sense of each of these schemas. But what happens in a sort of a person's life who has support, love, and nurture, these schemas are all very, when you ascertain if they're there and they're present, they're a very low mark if you're doing it. On this book, it asks 10 questions, and from the 10 questions, you can work out how high the score is. Now, most people would have a sense of abandonment, which is probably like within a very normal range. But for example, for myself, coming from a life where I felt abandoned continually by my father and my grandfather, this schema was really, really high. But then if I put in addiction, where I then abandon myself within the addiction, I basically, it's like dereliction, really. I walk out on myself, and I just allow myself to act in a manner where I just let myself, let addiction take over. And when you're in addiction, it's like having a twin that resides inside you. It's like there's 2 parts. It's, without sounding completely schizophrenic here, but it's like you've got a voice, a rational, there's sort of voice of reason, really, and then there's this complete sort of irrational, like almost like a sergeant major driving you to get more of the drugs and more of the alcohol, more of the addictive behavior. And hence in my life, I've seen people doing that. I mean, I didn't watch him physically, but my friend way back in the 90s, the first rehab I went into, he took somebody else's blood. It was HIV positive, and injected the blood into him so that he could get heroin from the prescribed by the government at the time, who if you were HIV positive back in the early 90s and you were a heroin addict, you got diamorphine amps, and which is like an ampoule which you can inject. I witnessed this behaviour where you see the levels that people will go. I went through borders, customs, death penalty, where it was death penalties. I had lots of drugs inside my body that could have burst at any time. I done crazy stuff. So that's an absolute abandonment of oneself, and also of any value system that you have. And of course, when we look at what kind of sort of like, if you think of, there is no way there's any self-esteem. There was a big ego, but there was no self-love. The next schema here, the mistrust and abuse schema, is really relevant, because when you're in addiction, everyone, well, not everyone, I'm sure, but a lot of people are out to get what they can, and because they're in their own addictions, so you can't really trust them. People overdose, people are left beside a skip or something when they're overdosed. It's a ruthless sort of lifestyle completely. So this life trap gets blown out of proportion too. It becomes really magnified when you're in the addiction. Vulnerability, you're incredibly vulnerable. You were vulnerable before, but now you are really vulnerable. The dependence one, you're really dependent on the drugs, so you become, or the behavioural, the addictive behaviour. So you're caught up in this continual need for more, and an insatiable appetite for, and every time. And the issue is with that it's not difficult to stop. It's to try and stay stopped. It's the difficulty, really. You can stop. Often drug addicts, alcoholics, they can stop for days. They can even stop for months sometimes. But it's staying stopped, because you've got the voice, the other voice that goes on in your head. This twin creates this selective amnesia, and it's part of the denial mechanism. It says, "Oh no, it wasn't too bad." It's like getting into a ring with Tyson, and you get beaten all over the ring, and a couple of weeks later you get back in training, you think, "Oh, maybe I can do it," and within a few months you're deluded again. You tell yourself, "Oh, I could do it in a way that I could win this time." But in fact, what happens? You get back in the ring, you get smashed all around the ring, and that works for a period of time. And that's often what it's like with that friend that took this HIV, that took the blood. He lived for 9 months, and because he took the back then, when there was no, treatment for HIV's moved on so much since then with combination treatment. But back then, he took in a massive viral loads into his body. His immune system wasn't prepared for it, and he died. So he got the money from the government, invalidity pension stuff, and he got the car, he got access to a car, and he got the heroin, but he only lived for 9 months. Now, I often think of that man, because I remember when I was walking down the road to him and he told me what he was going to do, I thought, that's insane. I thought, that is insane to take somebody's blood. But it's no different really from the girls who are prostituting themselves every night, that are getting beaten up or they're getting abused, but they have to keep going out to get the money, to get the drugs. Now, if that's not some sort of illness or mental illness, then I don't know what is really. Emotional deprivation, is what often happens in addiction. You wind up in environments where you surround yourself with the same group of people, because they collude with you. You don't find yourself much with people who are going to challenge your addiction. You deliberately surround yourself with people that are just exactly the same, if not worse, so that you can look down on them and say, "Oh well, I'm not as bad as them." And that's part of the denial mechanism as well, that you can look down and go, "Well, God, I've got still a bit of way to go before I'm really that bad." So the emotional deprivation is there's no love within that, because everybody's in their addiction. They're all incredibly self-centered most of the time, because they're just the sort of whole thinking, the life and thinking is controlled by this addiction, and their day is spent with getting and finding ways and means to get more of whatever the behaviour is. Social exclusion, there's a saying that we say in Narcotics Anonymous, they say that our illness expresses itself in antisocial ways that makes its detection, diagnosis, and treatment difficult, because you find that people they're on the fringes of society, of course, because they're not integrated, they're using drugs, they're using, and we have, in the UK, I've got to say, there's a really, since the rave scene in the 80s, and I've witnessed this happening, is there's a normalisation of drug use that's getting more and more so. Cocaine use, in most bars, you can see people using like I used to do this thing with the local authorities with an itomizer, where we would scan the top of systems, of toilet systems, and I watched a massive increase from 2004 to 2010, where they could find traces of cocaine on. So we've got a real, a development, and the reason that being is we've got much more sophisticated criminal networks, modern technology, phones, and we also have drug and alcohol services that are not equipped to deal with it. Because if I'm a dealer, right, if we think of it, what is my competition to a drug service is the drug dealer. And if I'm sitting here on Harley Street, I could phone up somebody now, and within 15 minutes, I mean, I've not done this for years because I'm 25-year clean, but I know that if somebody gave me a number, I could phone up a drug dealer in 15 minutes, they could meet me in Tesco's car park. Whereas a drug service usually say, oh, well, we'll book you an appointment next Tuesday at 4:30 or next Wednesday at 4:30. So in order for drug services to be able to tackle this effectively, they have to work in the same approach really as the drug dealer does. And the drug dealer doesn't waste time because he wants the money. So I, in my practice, whenever somebody phones me up, I try and see them. Like, often I can't see them in 15 minutes, obviously, because I've got a client, but I try and see them really quickly. I try and do a call with them. I try and speak to them and then engage, so that then, because there's a window of opportunity that often disappears unless you're really quick. And sometimes that window doesn't open up again. I've had lots of friends, most of my friends have died as a result of this addiction. I mean, I nearly died several times, and lots. So the other life traps here, defectiveness, when we're using drugs all the time, we feel an innate sense of defectiveness, which is, so whatever we felt before, that gets magnified, a sense of failure for sure, and subjugation, absolutely, because we have to, when you're in some type of addiction, you're continually having to people please to get to with drug dealers or whoever it is, to try and get and manipulate others to get the money or to get the drugs. Unrelenting standards is one that I didn't really have that bad when I first got clean. And an entitlement. There's a sense, and the entitlement is massive, is because it's basically saying that I don't have to follow the normal rules. They don't apply. I'm special and different, really. And I can do whatever I want to do, and regardless of the cost to others. So right, that's the main life traps that when I work with clients, I do an assessment. I do it from the Jeffrey Young book, Reinvent Your Life, page 15. I do the assessment, and from that first, I can ascertain what level each of these schemas is when I have a new client, because it's all clients with addictions, and they're all high functioning addicts. They're all people who are holding down jobs, are very successful, some of them, but their personal relationships are a mess. Their personal relationships are a mess because they're so focused on their addiction, whatever it may be. And so I find out from them, like, and I get them, we do the questionnaire, and then when we identify whatever schema it is, I also then go, right, okay, let's look at the chapters from the book, and let's do the individual schema and see what score you get. Now, on each of the chapters, it's, for example, on the the entitlement life trap on page 329, you can go in each of the chapters, it tells you and gives you, it describes a solution of what you're going to do when you identify. Now, the biggest thing here is to identify, once you can identify the schema and you can give it the narrative, and you can say, oh, right, this is what you can relate to it. That's one of the key steps to progress, really, because as soon as you identify, then you can go, okay, so how do I start to change the schema? Now, we need the therapist acts really as the healthy adult. Now, we talk about, I talk to you about that there's there's the vulnerable child, there's also the angry child, or they call it the impulsive child, but there's also the fun child, the happy child, and also we've got the demanding parent, right, mode, which is the inner critic inside, and we've got the punitive parent, right? So, and this ties in with a lot of transactional analysis stuff, really. Eric Berne stuff. It's like, so we, what we're identifying really is that we're trying to act with the client as that healthy adult, because at the beginning, if they don't have it, if they're thinking their inner critic and there's no sort of healthy part of their thinking, i.e. they're not able to give themselves affirmation and love or value inside, and they're just very condescending all the time on themselves, that the therapist, myself, I can start to challenge that and start to say, okay, well, if you had a good friend, and he was speaking to yourself like this, what do you think would be a different way to speak to yourself? Or what do you think about that? And get them to explore. Now, I want to go on to, because it's what they identify here is from the particular core wound stuff, the vulnerable child and the angry child, what responses come from that are usually a fight, fright, a fight, flee, or flight, freeze response. Now, for each of those models, right, is we've got different. So for the fight model, the main representation of how somebody copes with it, their coping strategies, is usually they're either a perfectionistic overcompensator. We see this all the time. People who are vulnerable inside, they can really overcompensate and be perfectionistic. And I've done this, like I do this, or you see it in a work setting. It might be the work colleague who it just works all day long and works from 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock at night. And if he does a spelling mistake, he's just absolutely starts to beat himself up. So that's one of the coping strategies. The other one is the bullying attack, right? Is when somebody just attacks is a bully. So, like you might say to them something about, oh, you've said this to me. What do you mean I've said that to you? And they can react in a sort of bullying attack way. We've got the self-aggrandizer, right? That the sort of egotistical, narcissistic chap or girl who, is sort of aloof in that way. And the other one is called a suspicious over-controller. Now, I can send these also later. I can send these. These are all, I've not put this on these slides, but I can send them over at a later date. So that's the fight coping strategies to deal, and these are set up specifically to deal with a wound, with a vulnerable child, to protect that vulnerable child. And then we've got the flight strategies, the avoidance, which are avoidance strategies, which is the detached protector, which is like, somebody who's there, but is sort of shut down, really, is detached, really. The sort of lights are on, but there's no one there. They're sort of there's the avoidant protector, who is just avoids situations continually. He doesn't want to, when that vulnerable child in them gets frightened or insecure, they'll avoid social events, so they'll avoid going to the party, they'll disappear, they won't show up at all. Or you have the angry protector, and that's the, we see, I've seen this countless times, where the angry protector, and not to get this mixed up with the angry child, the angry protector is where somebody really just is so angry, but just pushes everybody away continually. Like, it's like, no, there's nothing wrong with me, and just is very angry and hostile. And you can see that you don't want to be around them, because you can just sense their anger, and it's a mechanism to just keep that vulnerable child in them protected. And of course, I spoke about it before, we've got the detached self-soother. Now, the detached self-soother is the chap or girl who starts to use drugs, alcohol, to soothe that core wound, to soothe the initial pain. And as far as the freeze responses, we've only got one response really from one strategy, which is really compliant surrender. And that's just, and to some degree, you could say somebody's rock bottom might be in this freeze response, this compliant surrender. Is just when people give up, when they give up the fight, they just like, I can't do it anymore. And at that point, what around addiction, which is really important, I think, for me, and my own, and I've noticed it time and time again, is that there has to be a reduction of the ego. There has to be, often I find is that the self-esteem is very low, if terribly low. There's often self-loathing at the very, very core, which is the result of a lot of these schemas. But there's a point, there's a window where the ego is reduced significantly. The ego gets reduced to a point where it's possible for an intervention to come in, where they are, that it can't come in, because it can't come in while the ego is so robust, because you can't graft a new idea on a closed mind. It's impossible. So the ego has to be reduced to such a point, and it was with me. I was in a toilet in 1996 in St Thomas's Hospital, which is where my two children were born years later, which was I had a lot of gratitude about that, because I thought, my God, this is like, I looked in the mirror and I thought, my God, I'm still, I remember being in this toilet like 6 years before, and a rock bottom, 7 years before, and a rock bottom, like suicidal ideation, couldn't go on really, wanted to take my life. And then 7 years later, my first child, my son, was born in that same hospital. But what happened in that toilet that night was I shot up some heroin, and I started to overdose. And I had this moment, and I didn't quite overdose. I didn't go right over where I had overdosed several times before, but this night I didn't. And I came to, and somebody turned the lights out on the toilet. It was crazy, really. Somebody turned the lights out, and I thought I'd gotten blind. So then I seen a little slither of light at the bottom of the door, and I thought, oh God, right, okay. And then I got up and I went out the toilet and I put the light on. But I sat in that toilet that night, and I had a spiritual, emotional, mental rock bottom. And I had been for a while. I was spiritually, emotionally, and mentally bankrupt. And at that point, I cried out, something cried, not that I'm religious or anything, but I cried out some inside me for help. There was some part, like my spirit was crying out for help, really. I remember it really, really clearly. And within a few weeks, I wound up getting arrested. I wound up getting put in prison, which was really good, because it was the beginning of the recovery process for me, because I couldn't, I guess, whether it was a higher power, whether it was just I'm really into quantum physics. Maybe there was some sort of energy going on, or some other dimension working. I don't know, but something what I couldn't do for myself. It got the situation happened where I had to stop using, because I was forced to stop using in that prison, which is not often the case. You can get lots of drugs in prison. So I then and that was the beginning of it. So what I'm saying is that the ego, this thing, we can't graft a new idea on a closed mind, is really appropriate. Now, I'm aware I'm just coming to the end of this, and I want to make sure, what we're trying to nurture within this is we're trying to nurture the healthy adult. There's also the fun child. So it's not all doom and gloom here. It's like you've got, obviously you've got, you've got these sort of coping strategies that have been used over and over and over again. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to make the client get the client to see these coping strategies, and then start to build up the self-esteem, and to build up different strategies, and start to help the client then identify when he goes into these particular schemas where he finds himself, because these have been reinforced. It's not overnight. This doesn't change overnight. I mean, this takes continual practice. It's work. Nothing happens by osmosis. It's not like you just, okay, we identify these schemas, okay, happy days, okay, I'm going to work on this. What happens, but definitely, is as soon as the client gets more and more awareness of these particular schemas, he starts to see his own narratives and the thought process, and starts to dispute the story that he tells himself about himself, and starts to change the story, and starts to learn to like and hopefully love himself or herself at some point, and break down these patterns. Now, I think I'll leave it there, because I really want to hear if there's any questions, and I don't want to overrun here. So I think that's it. What I would say is, if you need any more information, I'll be around. Any other PowerPoint stuff that might be needed, I can sort of send that on to Niall, and that's it really.
I've got a client who has recently been to the Priory with alcohol and drug addiction and has refused to engage in the steps. We have a good therapeutic relationship, but I know little about addiction. Do I need to gently encourage him to find a new drug and alcohol therapist rather than me to collude with his addiction?
Right. So now that person's saying, like the person doesn't want to do the steps, and they're saying, oh, should I not work with them anymore because the person's still going to use, he still wants to use. Is that right? Is that what the client's saying?
He's saying that the person has been taken to the Priory for alcohol and drug addiction, but they've refused to engage with the steps when they've gone there. And the person, the therapist here, has a good therapeutic relationship, but knows very little about addiction.
Yeah.
So she's wondering, should they help them to find a new drug and alcohol therapist rather than them to collude with the addiction?
I mean, look, if the client started to use again, if the client started to use again, we need to, with addiction, we've got to really challenge. It's different. It's a different scenario here, as in with other models of therapy, where I think we've got to be very directive. I am very directive because I see it as a life-threatening condition. So if I think the client is using, and I suspect, they're back using. I mean, I get agreements and stuff to do drug tests and stuff. It's very different model from what, like where I think, if I think somebody's is in a dangerous situation and they would like to be drug tested, I can do that and facilitate that. But I'm very direct with them, and I'll say, look, this is what's likely to happen. Knowing from your history, this is what. So if this lady or man thinks that actually the client is hiding in the therapy and is actually not, if he thinks that the client's hiding and nothing's changing, then of course she could recommend like a different therapist, and somebody that might have much more knowledge of addiction and that could be quite direct with the client, or more direct with the client. And also, look, it's useful, and I think this is also very useful, that all therapists that are working with addiction have an understanding of the different models, because there's not just 12 steps, there's SMART groups. I mean, they're called rational recovery really in the States, but in America, in Britain, they're called SMART groups. So to work out the different support systems that are out, there's Christian-based 12 steps, there's lots of different groups that work with gay and lesbian people, or work with, there's a lot of different support networks out there for people, and there's all the Sabrista stuff, there's like 1 year no beer, there's all these different formats and it's good for us as therapists to know, in case somebody goes, no, I don't want to do 12 steps. Well, yeah, but you could do X, Y, and Z.
I was really interested about the 2 voices that you talked about. And I've definitely heard those myself. I'm wondering that in recovery, do you still have that rational voice and irrational? Is it about quieting it, or is it now one?
Yes, great question, Lydia. Right, I met Gabor Mate a couple of months ago, and I was talking to him about this. Right, so what I recognise, right, that voice is still there, but it's just not. It doesn't have the power that it used to have. So what certainly happened is when I got clean, that voice, the voice of the addict, say I call it the voice of the addict, was so powerful, and it controlled me absolutely until I went into the detox and got clean. So and what started to happen was the voice of recovery started slowly getting more powerful. But I went to a lot of 12-step meetings. So what started to happen was I developed a support network through my early years. And I would speak to, when the voice of the addiction was really strong, I'd phone people up and I'd say, oh God, my head is now telling me that I'm going to relapse at some point. I may as well relapse now. So I used people really where I didn't feel I could do it on my own. I felt I needed the help of other people. And so now, years later, what happens is I see the voice. Like, for example, recently I was in Panama, and I was looking down the Panama Canal, and I was in this rainforest, I was looking down from this rainforest, and I looked at these barges, and my head said, I bet you there's loads of cocaine on those containers going from, because we're right so close to Colombia, narco countries, only like 100 miles that way. And my head said, you know what, Mark, because I've been in Colombia, it said, you could just jump on a motorbike and go into narco country. So the voice of my addiction is always there, but it's just much more subtle and much more, but it's insidious, and it's there. But because I've been doing recovery for so long, I can identify it really quickly, and I can go, no, I'm not listening to you. That's like, I'm just not, and I dispute it, and I laugh at it a lot of the time, actually. So that's what certainly does happen with sobriety time, and the obsession and compulsion's gone. I've got no obsession or compulsion to do it.
That's interesting, thank you. And I think that sort of points to as well that there's kind of like a lifelong journey with recovery. I've listened to a lot of people talk about whether you're always, if you've been an addict, are you always an addict, etc. So it's kind of like you always need to work on recovery. So the second question is, you talked about temperament versus environment at an early stage of being kind of the biggest contributors. Which of those, and I've kind of put those into nature and nurture, do you think from personal experience and the people that you've worked with is the biggest sort of predictor of addiction? More?
I know. It's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting because would somebody who's got a temperate, right? So say I've got the oversensitivity, but say if I didn't have the environment, say I didn't have so much addiction in my family, it's almost like the perfect storm. I had the temperament, and then I had the environment, the exposure, the trauma, and then I had early exposure to drugs and alcohol. Yeah. So if we get the early exposure to drugs and alcohol as well, like 15, I mean, actually I was younger, I was 14 when I started to drink. So if you think of it, almost pre-puberty, so I'm already starting to change the neural pathways in my brain with alcohol. So it is like the perfect storm, the temperament mixed with the environment. Now, I don't know if you just had the temperament and you had the environment, or no environment, sort of like really healthy. I mean, the twin studies say it's 50%, isn't it? They do these studies and they say 50% of those that had the genetic, likely to have the genetic predisposing factor, then became alcoholics or addicts. So the sort of jury's still a bit out, but certainly I think the oversensitivity it can be a real benefit in life, being oversensitive, like, because you can really empathize and feel somebody's pain, but equally you can just overthink things so much and cause yourself so much pain, really, unnecessarily.
You mentioned in the talk, Mark, about the importance of nurturing the relationship with a healthy adult, and how important this is for anybody that wants to start really strengthening that relationship and making that maybe play a more central role in their lives. What advice would you give them to do that?
Well, I think a massive, I know a massive part of my recovery process, we're talking about healthy adults, was when I first got clean, I met, there was a couple of things that happened. One, that I met a man who'd already got sort of clean, sober, and he sort of had belief, and he said to me, oh, you can get, he asked me how much heroin I was using at the time, and I told him how much, and he said, and he'd done it, this guy had done it, he'd stopped, and he was in recovery, and he said to me, you can do this, Mark. And I looked into his eyes and he says, you can do it. Now, whereas I didn't believe in myself that I could do it, but because he believed that I could do it, because I believed that he knew that I could do it, that was enough to make me believe that I could possibly do it. So there's something about, like, if I don't have the belief, and I know this with clients, right, is when clients come in and they really don't, because they're just like, they've tried and they've not been successful, and they've almost given up. And I say, yeah, but I believe if I can do it, you can do it, right? And you can do it. Now, if somebody else believes in you, that can be enough to get you over that first bit until you can learn to believe in yourself, and I was very fortunate because as I said, I met Eric. Really, look, my thing about Eric Clapton was, I knew when I met him, his child had fell out a window, right, in New York, 15 floors or whatever. I mean, I talked to him about this years later, but he'd went, I mean, I don't think there's anything probably so painful as losing a child, right? Now, that happened to him, and I know that when that happened, he wrote an album called Pilgrim, and he absolutely, and the people in Manhattan and the 12 Steps came and got him every day and took him to meetings, and they kept saying, Eric, share, just keep talking about the pain, the emotional pain that you feel about the loss. Now, throughout the years, I've met other men and women who went through deep. I mean, I've sat on hospital beds with friends of mine that are dying of cancer, and they've been sober and clean all throughout their life, and they're just about to go. The final thing that they're going to meet is their death, but they're doing it with dignity. There's a saying they say, whenever a man or woman enters the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous, the heavens fall silent and God listens, because a human being's dignity is about to be restored. Now, what I see clearly is as a result of breaking addictions, their dignity, people's dignity and self-respect gets restored. Now, what happens within is that with these healthy sort of parent types that I've met, or I call them Eskimos really, because they're people that sort of give me this impression that, and help me and maybe open up a door, or certainly change my perspective of thinking about something that. And I remember once in Colombia, I went to an Narcotics Anonymous meeting, and there was a guy who was blind, who had been in a cartel actually, and he'd been shot, and he'd lost his sight. And he was saying, and he was sharing, and he said, just because I've lost my sight doesn't mean that I should use cocaine. Just because I'm blind, you know. And these are like the Eskimos. These are like these people that they provide hope and inspiration. And I think for me, I became that in myself as well, that I through time became my own healthy adult, that I gave my, that because I've went through so many experiences where it's been painful in my recovery, but I've just went, no, I'm not going to go back. It's like everything in life, isn't it? If it's not growing, if it's not moving forward, it's decaying, or it's stable. So in recovery, we just keep moving forward, and we learn to emotionally soothe and regulate, it's self-soothe and regulate. So at the beginning, I had some friends that were really sort of nurturing, maybe Eric being one of them. There was other people, and then through time, you develop your own. You develop your own hope, and you inspire yourself, really.
That's very well said, Mark. And I think the main point there is, whenever someone like yourself has been through this process and you're able to say to someone, I was in your shoes and things can get better, it offers so much hope for people. They can see the light at the end of the tunnel. But that's all we've got time for today. Before you go, Mark, I just want to say thanks so much for a brilliant presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I think people have got loads from it. So well done. People can find you online at markdempstercounseling.com. The two books, where can people get those?
They're on Amazon. Just go into put my name, Mark Dempster, on Amazon, and then Mark Dempster, Nothing to Declare, or The Ongoing Path, and it'll come up. Should come up right away.
Brilliant. Well, Mark, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. And everybody else, we're back at 2:30 UK time for our next talk from Mark Lewis. So see you guys then, and talk to you soon. Cheers.
Cheers, Niall. Thank you.